So welcome. I'm so pleased to be here tonight to be talking to Sylvia Nasar. As you've just heard, she's of course the author of A Beautiful Mind. I'm going to say a little bit about that. It's a very special book. When it came out, I couldn't quite hear the description before, but I'm sure you're all aware that it is a biography of John Nash, who is a mathematician and who invented game theory and then went on to win a Nobel Prize for economics. And all this despite some terrible struggles with mental illness, with schizophrenia. The book was a bestseller. It was published in 30 languages, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and it was also, of course, as you're all aware, made into a wonderful movie starring Russell Crowe, our own Russell Crowe. I'm not sure if it's the only movie about economic theory that has won Oscars, but it's certainly the only one that I know of. Yes. So again, Sylvia is a professor of business journalism at Columbia University. She's contributed to many publications over the years. I just half heard Jenny telling you a few of them, but I'm certainly aware of her contributions to The New Yorker, to Newsweek, and to The New York Times. She has also been the recipient of many awards, notably for me, the Berlin Prize and also a Los Angeles Times Book Prize. But of course, tonight, we are here to discuss Grand Pursuit, the story of economic genius. This book is a history of 19th and 20th century economic thought, and it is at once serious and profound and incredibly entertaining at the same time. It traces the genesis of ideas that we're still very compelled by today. So ideas like how inevitable is poverty, how important dignity is in an economic system. And I was delighted to read, it also talks about the genesis of the idea that you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one basket, which I would have thought was an innate quality or an innate piece of knowledge, but apparently it is not. So these big ideas and the evolution of economics itself are told through the significant events and very interesting characters of this time period. So once again, thank you. Welcome, Sylvia. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to say I'd like to thank the Wheeler Center for this wonderful opportunity, and I'd like to thank you for coming tonight, and to thank Chris for, we've already been having a wonderful conversation downstairs. It's great to be here. I was married to an Australian. My best friend is from Perth. Other best friends live here in Melbourne. My kids have been here. And all these years, I've never been able to come to Australia, and I'm so happy that Grand Pursuit brought me here. So thank you.
How did you find the flight if it was the first time out?
Well, fortunately, I didn't get to Australia until I'd spent a week in Auckland recovering from the 20-hour flight.
Great.
It was like, it felt like I'd been hit with a sandbag. And usually I've been to Russia, I've been to China, I've been to India, and Abu Dhabi, I've always bounced right back and been right out there the next day. And this really,
it's like nothing else. It really is, yes.
But it was worth it. It was definitely.
Of course it was.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah. Well, I wanted to start off noting that not only is A Grand Pursuit a really wonderful book, but I think your timing is amazing because, you know, unfortunately for all of us, we live in such interesting economic times. And you know, as I've struggled to come to terms with the economics of the 21st century, just all the huge issues right now, the euro, the greenback, the issues of global trade, and of course the global financial crisis of 2008, banks, all of that. It's just become really clear to me that I have very little grounding in the history of economics and in how economics has evolved. And perhaps some of you here tonight have a similar experience to the one I had, which is that I was in the arts faculty at Melbourne University in the late 1980s. And within about 6 months of starting at uni, and without taking a single course in economics or anything like that, I had worked out everything that was wrong with the world, and I knew how to end poverty forever. It's really very simple. All you had to do was unite the workers of the world. That was the number one. And number two, you had to take all the money from the rich people and distribute it evenly amongst the poor people. I believed this for a long time, but it has not worked out to be a very solid foundation for me for adult life. So I'm extra pleased to be taking this tour of these ideas and this history with you, and perhaps you can fill in some of those gaps for me. So let's start with A Grand Pursuit, and let's start at the beginning. You begin with Dickens and A Christmas Carol, a story with which we're all familiar. It's a morality tale. It's about greed and generosity and human connection. But I had no idea that it was actually written as a much more pointed political tract. Is that right?
That's right. I decided to start this story of the invention of modern economics, which is really the idea that humanity, after several thousand years, is finally ready to take hold of its own fate, to change its own material circumstances. And I decided to start with Dickens because actually modern economics starts with an active imagination. And Dickens was living in London at the height of the Industrial Revolution, incredible technological and social changes going on. And what did the economic wise men of the day, such as John Stuart Mill or Karl Marx, have to say? They basically said, in this period of incredible creativity and change, that the future looked pretty grim, that the nation might get wealthier, as Adam Smith had predicted, but not the bottom 9/10 of the population, which probably would have included all of us. The bottom 9/10 in Jane Austen's lifetime lived no better than a Roman slave. 2,000 years of human progress, but had zero effect on the quality of life of most people. And here we are in London in the mid-19th century, and people like Mill are saying that England has pretty much reached her economic potential, and that in any case, even if England continues to get richer, it's not going to lift the real wages or living standards or quality of life of the people at the bottom. So Dickens, of course, was not just a great novelist, he was a journalist. And unlike Karl Marx, he was looking all around him, and he went to the United States on a book tour, and even though he hated America, he was a good reporter. He noticed that something was happening that completely contradicted the dismal science. The working classes seemed to be moving up. They were living better. They had more opportunities. So he came back to London at a time of deep depression, great worry about the future food supply, and he writes The Christmas Carol. And The Christmas Carol, what does it say? The Christmas Carol is a picture of a world of abundance There's food all over the story. And its message is that, that economics is no longer a zero-sum game. In other words, Scrooge and Cratchit can both do better. The world is expansive enough to allow that. Their interests are not diametrically opposed. So this was Dickens' first foray into calling for a new economics, not the dismal science that said that there are no more possibilities for, and things can't change for most people, but a new and more cheerful science that that suggested that history need not repeat itself.
Right.
And he was, people called him Mr. Sentiment, that his vision of class cooperation, of mutual sympathy, and of mutual improvement was silly and sentimental. But you know what? He was so much more prescient than some of the great economists of the day, like Mill and Marx, because actually a revolution in living standards was going on right outside Dickens' window. It was the first time in history, in the history of the world, that living standards of ordinary people were actually moving up. And it was the beginning of the modern revolution in living standards that completely distinguishes the world in which we live, in which the average person lives better and better and longer, in complete contrast to humanity through all time.
Right. And they started from this terrible low place as well. I was really struck the life expectancy of someone in Manchester at the time was 31 or 32, which is just extraordinary.
Well, people today, this was in the middle of the 19th century was the beginning of a process that today has brought us to a place where the average citizen of the globe, not of a rich country like Australia or the US or England, the average citizen of the globe, of which, of course, there's 6 times as many as there were then, lives 10 times better, lives 2.5 times longer, okay? So people now have 1.5 more lives than they did, and they have 10 times as many means with which to pursue their own ends. Yeah. And that is, and of course, in a country like this, the change is, even much greater.
That's right. And so I think now's a great moment to ask you about Karl Marx, because his vision of the future was a somewhat different one. And I think we also regard him as a very powerful historic figure, as someone who, who wanted to lift up the worker, who wanted to eradicate inherited advantage. But I was fascinated by your account of his personal finances, which were a little inconsistent with his philosophy.
Well, one of the differences writing this book versus A Beautiful Mind was that in reporting A Beautiful Mind, there were no footprints in the snow. I discovered the story of John Nash, and there was no one in front of me. In this book, everyone I wrote about, every historical event. There's, a whole library of scholarly works. And yet, and this is the great thing about history, as well as journalism, there are always new things to discover, such as that Karl Marx, who immigrated to London in around 1850, spent 20 years trying to finish Capital, was there supposedly because this was the window on modernity. This was, the society that showed where the world was going, this commercial society. Karl Marx, in fact, never talked to any of the amazing people who were amazing Victorian intellectuals, journalists, scientists, all of whom were obsessed with economics and were constantly arguing over whether, this new market economy was going to benefit a lot of people or very few. He never set foot, never set foot in a factory.
That was a stunning revelation.
Stunning. And even though he never held, now this is something that is actually quite a feat, never held a job. And he managed to enjoy an income that put him in the top 2% of British households.
And where did that money come from? There are a variety of very suspicious sources.
Well, let's see. Marx had a great contempt for money making, unless it was of the inherited kind. So he had several inheritances, and he also had a guardian angel, namely Friedrich Engels, who was willing to hold down a job and also to write. See, I always thought that at least Marx had written this column for the Herald Tribune, American paper, edited by Horace Greeley.
That was his main work, right? That was the main job that he had.
It turned out that someone went into the archives of the Tribune, and guess what? Engels wrote every single one of Marx's columns.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
But, these are funny, but the big point about Marx and the reason it made I had kind of fun with it, was that he completely missed. It wasn't that his predictions were all wrong, which they were. It was that he missed what was going on outside his own window, which is that the average person was moving up.
Right.
Something that he, of course, proved was impossible.
Right.
And it amazes me still that when I was a graduate student in the early 70s, people like Paul Samuelson and my professors at NYU, everyone spoke of Marx so reverently.
Yes.
Okay?
That's right.
And, boy, talk about an intellectual emperor with no clothes.
Right. And what was in it for Engels? Because he didn't just write Marx's columns. He actually, Engels worked in a factory in order to supply Marx with money.
He was
right?
a man,
Engels, not a laborer, but a manager.
Engels was funny because, first of all, he wrote a bestseller in about 6 weeks. He was a demon for work. He was extremely facile and fluent. Of course, they were the kind of journalists, both of them, Engels included, who they knew the answer and they went out and found the facts that conformed to their presupposition. But Engels was also a sort of frustrated intellectual, in the sense that he came from a business family. He wasn't allowed to get the education, to get a PhD like Marx's mail order doctorate in philosophy, and he felt obliged to go into the family business, which was sort of a German-English venture in Manchester, making cotton thread. But he had a very exaggerated reverence for pure intellectuals like Marx, who,
right.
And he tolerated his writer, 20 years of saying, I'm almost finished, I'm almost done, it's practically in the mail, I'm just, doing a few edits.
He was a real deadline dodger too, wasn't he? Marx's list of excuses might help me out, I don't know, in the next 5 years or something. He had liver trouble, he had rheumatism, he had a bad case of boils, which prevented him from finishing Das Kapital.
His wife was giving him grief.
Yes, it is hard.
But anyway, the point is that that Engels was, both of them came from Germany. They despised the English, what they called Jewish, mercenary commercial culture. They came knowing that it couldn't work, that it was doomed to destruction, and they were also there to prove that English economics was nothing but propaganda for the business owners, and that's the kind of journalism they did.
Right. So there are so many interesting characters in your book. Well, I'm going to jump ahead now a little bit. I want to ask you about Irving Fisher, who contributed many things, but most interestingly, he was the first person to build a model of the economy. But when we talk about models of the economy today, what we mean are abstract representations, and often in computers. But his model was an actual model of the economy, right?
Yes. Look, most of the people in this book, whether it was Alfred Marshall or Beatrice Webb or Schumpeter or Joseph or Fisher or Keynes, of course, they didn't start out to become economists. Economists never had that attractive a reputation, especially to 18-year-olds. And Fisher, like some of the others, started out in mathematics and science, and almost all of them, all of these characters were drawn by usually some crisis. Like, I'm sure that the financial crisis of 2008 drew a lot of smart young minds to economics because it posed new problems and questions, and that's exactly what happened to Fisher. But he had this real first of all, experience in laboratory. He was actually also an inventor. He invented the Rolodex, which made him rich. But so when he wrote his thesis on the circulation of the flow of money through the economy, which was really his, he was the first person to really understand it, he decided to build a physical model of the economy involving, it was like a table, it involved a lot of water, and it showed how the economy, if it got a shock, a jolt from the outside that there were all these reactions, and it was an equilibrating process. So he had this little general equilibrium model that showed how the economy that started at one place, got some external stimulus, how it achieved a new equilibrium.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Well, and as you said, there are so many interesting characters living interesting lives and bringing very different things to economics and to really creating economics.
Yes.
As they entered the field.
Now, Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes, you're probably more familiar with Keynes, but the two of them together, and this is something I didn't know. I mean, I knew that John Maynard Keynes had invented, I thought in the 1930s, the economics of the whole. In other words, how different parts of the economy are interdependent and work together, as opposed to individual markets like the labor market. But it turns out that it was actually Irving Fisher who got Keynes onto this. And what both of them realized is that the two short-term economic disorders that are really incompatible with the long-term survival of markets, free markets, and democracy are high inflation and high unemployment, that they stemmed from the same cause, okay? And it was a disease of the circulatory system, okay? It was either a money drought produced a depression and high unemployment. A money flood produced high inflation. And both of them had terrible political as well as economic consequences. The great thing about that insight, which sounds kind of abstract, is that it meant that the governments could actually do something to fight depressions. Okay, previously, everyone understood that the market economy over time produced this rising productivity and rising living standards. This progress and growth was interrupted periodically, as we all know, by these terrible financial crises, followed by deep recessions and long periods of unemployment. And yes, then there was a recovery and progress continued. But so what Keynes and Fisher showed is that these crises were not like the weather, which is what everyone thought. They were neither inevitable, and much more important, they didn't have to be endured. That because the one variable that governments, even in the 19-teens and 20s, controlled was the issuance of money. So governments could affect this flow of money through the economy, which is just the same as the physical infrastructure. In other words, the physical infrastructure is, if bridges are falling down and railroad lines are blown up, it's very hard to move goods and services. Well, that's the same idea with the flow of money. So the point is that they were the first to show that was the source of the disturbance, and that therefore governments could fight depressions. Now, of course, this was very, very controversial. after World War I, when the economy of Europe lay in ruins and all those connections and that flow of money and credit was completely shattered, John Maynard Keynes and Fisher tried to argue that the Allies needed to focus on European recovery. They were not listened to, and Keynes...
This was at the Majestic, wasn't it?
This was at the
Treaty of Versailles.
So Keynes was, this young Treasury official, and, Fisher was writing his editorials in the New York Times, and they were not listened to, okay? And the consequences were very severe. For example, there were revolutions in Russia and Munich and Hungary, etc., and terrible hyperinflations and all of which had tremendous consequences. In the Great Depression, they argued that no, this is not, we are not being punished because we had an excessive boom. Right. It's not a morality tale. There's a disturbance in the flow of money. Our banking system has collapsed. The governments need to flood the economy with money. Their advice was not taken, or rather, it was not taken by the United States and by Britain, both of which suffered Great Depressions. The small countries that did follow their advice, actually, like Sweden and Brazil and Argentina, had no Great Depression. It was a great natural experiment that showed whose theory was right and whose theory was wrong. But after World War II, the leaders, the Allied leaders, had come around because the evidence from the Great Depression was so compelling, and did exactly what Keynes and Fisher had been arguing all along, and that's why we had Bretton Woods, right, and the focus on post-war economic recovery.
Yeah, and Keynes's evolution through that time, or the impact of history. He was almost a Zelig-like figure, being present where the Treaty of Versailles was hammered out, and then later at Bretton Woods. And he's kind of there for so much, these hugely significant moments of the 20th century. And he uses, or he's deeply engaged with all of them.
And what is amazing to me about Keynes, and one reason that I admire him so much, is that he was his advice was so often rejected. Right. And yet he never lost faith in the market economy, in democracy. He was, witheringly critical of, of policymakers. He didn't suffer fools lightly, but he never became cynical, and he never stopped offering. He always thought that that things could be done better, and that he had some suggestions to make about how that might be done. So all those years of rejection, yet he still kept, he didn't it's like so many English and American intellectuals say, well, obviously, the West is over, obviously the Soviet Union has all the answers. He just never went there. And lo and behold, after World War II, his advice is taken, and the third time around.
Yes, and he was still there. Yes, which was critical. It was so interesting as well. He was friends with the Bloomsbury Group, with all of those very interesting artists.
Yes.
And do you think that impacted, I mean, maybe that contributed to his sort of perseverance in the face of rejection? How did they shape his life?
Well, it was interesting because, first of all, he was, he started as a mathematician, and yet he was a great, lover of Western civilization and of the arts and ballet. He was gay, but he had a great marriage to this fabulous Russian ballerina.
Right.
His best friends were Duncan Grant and Virginia Woolf. He, in his first tour at the Treasury, and his role was always war finance. In other words, his job was to get the Americans to lend the Brits money so that the Brits could finance the French and their own war effort. And in the middle of World War I, when the Treasury had cut the National Gallery's budget to zero because it was felt that, while the men are sacrificing, the government shouldn't be spending money on pictures, Keynes heard that Degas' entire estate was going to go on the auction block in Paris. Now, the German army was outside Paris. It was shelling Paris. But Degas, of course, had not only been a great painter, but he was also an art dealer, and he had an incredible collection. Okay, so Keynes convinces the Treasury that buying French pictures is better than taking French IOUs for war loans. So they give the head of the gallery £10,000, and he and Keynes go across the channel, disguise themselves with fake mustaches, and sneak into the auction, okay, while, the Germans are shelling. And, of course, the whole point was that prices were really going to be depressed because the Germans were about to take Paris, okay? And sure enough, they came back with armloads of Seurat, Matisse, Monet, etc. And Keynes got a few for himself. He left one of them at the bottom of the hill, leaned up against the mailbox with a note to Duncan Grant, to come and, pick it up because he was, too tired to carry it up the hill. Anyway, the point is that he was a great, he believed in the arts, and he said that economists were not the trustees of civilization. That was the artists, people like Virginia Woolf. They were the trustees of the possibility of civilization. In other words, economists worried about the environment for creativity. And he hoped that, and I thought that was so...
it's lovely.
It was lovely, and it was so apt, and he did take care of, all of the Bloomsburys had, they had trust funds, and all of them were innumerate. So they kind of thought he was a Philistine because he, had to do with money, but they let him invest their trust funds. He lost their money a couple of times, but
he got it back, didn't he?
But in 1936, when the U.S. stocks were trading at about 1/10 of their 1929 value, Maynard Keynes made a big bet on American bank stocks, and he and his Bloomsbury friends never had to look back. They were rich for
that
life.
That was it. That was a wonderful bet. I think we're going to have some questions in just a few minutes, but before we do, I have to mention the two women in your book, the two key female figures who were so interesting. I'd never heard of them before. There was Beatrice Potter, who had many achievements, was a founding member of the Fabian Society, but I was very taken with your description of her, that behind every great woman there is a remarkable father. And I could see the ways in which that was true of her, but I thought that was a really beautiful aphorism and a way to think about daughters and fathers. And then, of course, there was the fascinating Joan Robinson, who had a fatal attraction for Stalinism and who had this very intense relationship with the Stalin regime and ended up being used by them in some quite disturbing ways. We've just got a few minutes to talk about them, but just wanted to alert you all to these characters as well, because their lives are so interesting.
Yeah, I thought Beatrice, it's funny because Beatrice Webb, née Potter, was probably, she was very, very famous in her lifetime. She also knew, she was friends with she knew everybody, every politician, every artist, every important person, because she was the most prominent and influential economic intellectual of, between the, say, 1890 and the 1930s. She is the inventor of the modern idea of the welfare state. Okay, not the socialist state, but the welfare state, the welfare, or what Schumpeter called the tax state. And her argument was for taxing the most productive members of society to subsidize the least productive by having the government guarantee a minimum standard of living for everyone. Her argument was not charity, like let's do it because it's, a good thing to do, which wouldn't have really cut much ice, because the conventional wisdom was that if you did that, you would destroy the dynamic that was leading to higher productivity and higher living standards. Her argument, she made a supply side argument saying that, look, the bottom third of the English population is so debilitated by bad nutrition, bad health, and illiteracy, that poverty is self-perpetuating among this group, and economic growth is not going to help them. But if the government provides that national minimum, these people will become, they'll be able to work, they'll be able to serve in the army, they'll contribute, and it'll make the English economy more productive. And who bought that, and who is the first politician to implement her ideas wasn't FDR in the New Deal, and it wasn't the Labor government of 1944. It was Winston Churchill and his partner Lloyd George in a government that was a liberal government that was elected in 1908 and passed the first welfare legislation, namely the minimum wage.
Right. She didn't think much of Churchill when she first met him, though, did she? She's a little bit of a snob. Oh, my God. She was, she had, very, she thought that he was a real lightweight. And he bragged that he never did his own brain work, because that's something you get other people to do. And, and this was actually her great insight, that the politicians
British ruling class, the last thing that they did was to come up with their own ideas, that therefore there was a role for people like her and her husband, Sidney, who could provide those ideas, and that's exactly what they did. They were a two-person think tank. She was beautiful, rich. I mean, her trust fund was really big, and she knew what she wanted. She wanted to, provide politicians with the ideas that she felt were right, and her idea was that the welfare state would actually strengthen the economy, not weaken it. And that's the idea that, that's what won over the political class.
Right.
And it's been there ever since. And whenever I hear people saying, "Oh, the welfare state is doomed, or it's dying," I think, no. It wasn't something that was born in an emergency that just lingered on. It was an institution that grew out of the first really prosperous period in human history, and it's here to stay.
Yeah, that's good news. Perhaps we should take some questions from the audience now. I want to make sure you get a chance. I can see a hand down there.
Well, I welcomed your book, Sylvia. In fact, I was just remembering I was tracking that book because I loved the title, Grand Pursuit. And in fact, I ordered it on Amazon, and then the Hill of Content, which is a famous bookshop, already had it, so I bought 2 copies. Anyway, I welcome your book because it's I'm the president of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia, and I've written quite a bit on Joan Robinson.
Fantastic.
I recently discovered it when I was at Monash in 1975. I was in the library reading economics, and Joan Robinson was next door at the lecture theatre giving this grand lecture, which was the outcome of that was, doing some archival research. Anyway, let's get back to Joan Robinson. There used to be a program called Dallas, which I never saw, and there was a plot line saying, "Who shot JR?" And that was the one negative perception I got of your book, that your treatment of Joan Robinson is extremely vitriolic. Joan Robinson was a great theoretical master. One of the great tragedies of economics was she was never given a Nobel Prize, particularly to encourage more women into economics. I wrote an article about Joan Robinson, spurred on by a comment she made in her dying days that economic theory had come apart in her hands. And that comment said in 1982, very apt for 2007. Anyway, let me get back to the question. What motivated you behind the rather sarcastic treatment of Joan Robinson, given that she should have won the Nobel Prize and given that she was almost the equal of Keynes, but you've presented her as a very
I'm interested to hear your framing. I was not familiar with Joan Robinson at all before reading this book, but I didn't get sarcasm. I mean, I thought she was quite a controversial, interesting figure. But tell us how you thought about her.
Look, Joan Robinson, for those of you who don't know who she is, was a disciple of John Maynard Keynes in the She was part of a group around Keynes when he wrote his great work, the general theory of interest, money, and employment. I'm sorry, I have such a terrible memory. Anyway, look, I would say that first of all, she wouldn't have been a character if she hadn't made an important contribution. And her contribution was that she was a very important insight into how large firms, which of course, by the 1930s dominated the economy, how they operated. It was a theory of the large firm. And that was there was a very creative contribution. Now, she became very disillusioned, like many intellectuals in her generation, became very disillusioned. And unlike Keynes, okay, she took the Great Depression to not to be a self-inflicted policy mistake, but a deep flaw in Western market economies. She had no use for democracy, and at that point, she stopped being very creative, and she fell in love. She had a serial love affair with, first it was Stalin, then it was Mao, it was finally Kim Il-sung. In other words, three of the, worst dictators, tyrants, and murderers of the century, and she was wrong about, deeply wrong about, about the entire post-war period. In other words, she thought that that the West had kind of run out, that the average person in the West wouldn't do better, that the answers lay in the Soviet Union, China. She was in China during the Mao famine, okay? She was one of the deniers. Now, look, none of the characters in this book, Keynes included, were right all the time, okay? And many of them were deeply flawed, okay? And I think that's what I tried to show them in their most admirable and creative, but I also showed where they were wrong. And I think Joan Robinson is a tragic case, because she could have been. She obviously was. She was one of the most brilliant people and strong-minded people of her generation. She kind of ruined Cambridge economics. Okay. And it was, because of her politics.
Are there other questions? There's quite a few.
Sylvia, with your balanced view over the range of economic thought in the last couple of centuries, it'd be great to have your views on what's going on in the world at present, where we have the Fed quantitative easing, pouring money into the American economy, and we have Southern Europe being restrained while there's very high unemployment rates.
Well, the great thing about history is that it's a laboratory, okay? And we can see, we all have views, things that we think are, we can test them. And just like in 1931, when you had Keynes on one side saying that the government could and should fight the Depression with monetary stimulus, okay, by, creating, by pushing, money and credit into the economy, and you had on the other side Friedrich Hayek and Joseph Schumpeter arguing the opposite, that that the bust was because of excesses in the boom, and I'm sure you've heard this, that that stimulus was like giving somebody with a hangover a drink, and that the answer was for governments to keep money tight, balance their budgets, and let the economy recover, let nature's cure take over. Okay, so very clear positions, absolutely the opposite. What happened by 1933? The United States, which rejected Keynes's advice, economy shrank by 1/3, okay? 1/3 of the population was unemployed, prices collapsed. The economies that rejected Hayek and Schumpeter's advice and took that of Keynes, like Sweden, Brazil, Argentina, who responded to the depression, to the financial collapse with monetary stimulus, never had a Great Depression, okay? So and England, which was kind of an in-between case, had an in-between depression. It's a very clear experiment with dramatic results, which kind of knocked the natural cure, or in contemporary terms, German argument, out of the water. And I would say today, the U.S., of course, we had a conservative, Republican central bank head who nonetheless was an expert on the Great Depression. He responded to the financial crisis by opening the monetary floodgates. In Europe, when I was in Spain last October, 4 years after the financial crisis, only then were the Germans talking to the Spaniards about recapitalizing the Spanish banks. And not only were 1/4 of the Spanish workforce out of work, but people expected unemployment to stay in that range for years to come. I think the evidence is there. The evidence is there. And, all we have to do is acknowledge it.
Okay, I think maybe we have time for one more question, but let me remind you that Sylvia will be signing copies of her book in the foyer after the talk. Is there one more question?
I'll try and be quick. I was quite appalled and shocked by your Marx bash. I don't really care what you think of him, but I think that most writers understand it's very difficult to write and work at the same time. The relationship between Marx and Engels was that Engels was his patron. Engels didn't work in a factory. He owned those factories in Manchester. His German family owned them. So he supported Marx so that Marx could go to the library, the British Library, and actually write Das Kapital and everything else, and they wrote numerous books. Engels wasn't a frustrated intellectual. He is recognised as a great philosopher. Anyway, my question is, if they were so wrong, and I forgot to mention that Marx buried 3 of his children. That's one of the reasons why there was so much grief. But my question is, if Marx was so wrong, why is America in the mess it is today? Millions of unemployed, millions of people who are homeless, and the politicians have no answers. So perhaps we can...
I'm sorry, Sylvia, we'll have to keep this answer really short.
Okay.
I think we've got the question.
Look,
we're going to keep... No. Sorry, we've just got a few minutes.
I'm going to address
keep it really short.
Look, the United States has had 35 recessions in the last, since the Civil War. And probably, Australia's had a similar number. Some of them have been great. Not only the 30s, but the 1890s. This last one was minuscule by those standards, although much more severe than any other recession we've had in the last 30 years. However, those downturns have taken place against an upward trajectory, okay? They have been a step back in a huge rise in the average standard of living, okay? So in Western economies, growth, these episodes occur, and I agree with you that, I'm not in the let's not do anything about it school, but they have never meant either, before we had a Federal Reserve, before we had, interventionist policies, or now, they have never meant that that the standard of living of any generation has not been radically higher than the previous one, including the Depression generation, the World War II generation, my generation. And that is the extraordinary. Of course we can do better, but we should recognize the extraordinary success, because we want to expand upon it rather than turn our back on it. And that is exactly what India and China, okay, Joan's two favorite countries, okay, have done, okay?
Okay, Sylvia, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
I think we're going to have to finish.
Of course.
There's another event on. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
We can talk outside.
You can talk outside. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Sylvia Nasar. Thank you very much.
And thank you.